When I was a kid on vacation in Michigan, we would wind up in this little country church that was very different from the church that I worshiped in during the rest of the year. And my favorite part of this service every week was an open mic prayer time. That's not what they called it, but that's what it was. And I loved it because you never knew what one of these crazy farmers was going to say. I remember walking out of the service one time with my parents afterward, and I told my dad how much I liked that sense of no one knows what's going to happen. And he said to me, that's exactly why we don't do it at home. And his wisdom really came back to me when I was serving my very first church, which had that exact method of saying prayers each week in worship. And my role as the pastor was to listen carefully to whatever anyone said, subtly reinterpret it, say it back to them, and then say, Lord, hear our prayer. And I would do that every week with my heart in my throat. But after a couple of years, I realized this was a well-behaved congregation, and nothing too out of line was happening. Sometimes things would happen in poor taste. Someone would unveil themselves as having just been diagnosed with cancer or going through a terribly hard time, and we would all pray, and then the next person would stand up and ask that the Bears win their first playoff game, and I would always wonder, did you not hear what she just said? But nothing too dramatic would happen. After a couple of years at that church, we had an intern who was a student at McCormick Theological Seminary here in Chicago, and he was a hipster, one of the first sort of hipsters as an adult that I'd ever met. His name was Keith Scott. He's now a UCC pastor down in Florida. I think Keith was the first person that I ever saw wearing a pair of skinny jeans. I remember it, actually, in the church kitchen. Like, whoa, look at how tight those pants are. And Keith also had these great cultivated long dreads. He was just a wonderful guy, a very charismatic person, very cool. He was a member of Trinity United Church of Christ, also here in the city. And Keith, the first time he had to lead the open mic prayer time, he asked me how to do it, and I told him, it's very simple. I told him just what I told all of you, and I said, nothing too dramatic ever happens. Don't worry, Keith. So, midway through the prayers, an older white man who I'd known for 5 years, I think maybe at this point, but I'd never heard say a word, stood up and he said, I haven't seen colors in 20 years. I could only see gray. But today I woke up and I can see red and green and purple colors everywhere, and some of the colors are speaking, and some of them are speaking, and some of them are singing, and I just want to say hallelujah. Sitting in the front row, and Keith just glared at me. And I said a silent prayer that I wasn't leading the prayer time that day, and a great pause settled over the congregation. And then Keith said this, brother had a vision, now his life is going to change. Lord, hear our prayer. That's the best definition of an epiphany that I've ever seen. The light shines, you see it, and now your life is going to change. Picture jewel-encrusted crowns and purple flowing robes. Picture 3 men of regal bearing under the glare of a midday sun. The stars obscured by daylight. And they question the wisdom of the journey. These people are long accustomed to luxury. They're hungry and they're tired, and they grumble to themselves and they grumble to each other, and they wait impatiently for dark. The star begins to rise before the sun has set. At first it's a pale beauty off in the gloaming. It really starts to shine at dusk. The kings adjust their crowns. They climb atop their camels and they continue riding. They are fueled by hope. They are eager to meet the newborn Prince of Peace. And eventually this long journey ends, and they come to a place of poverty and sacred beauty. And they kneel before a peasant family, and they offer gifts, and they look level-eyed into the face of God. And now their lives are going to change. The story says that when the wise men arrived in Jerusalem, Herod was frightened. When the wise men arrived, when these kings arrived, Herod was frightened. Herod was frightened because he knew their arrival signified the birth of a new king, arrival to Herod's throne. I've spent more hours than I ever thought imaginable watching youth basketball over the past 2 or 3 years. 2 of our children are on these AAU teams that will have 4 or 5 games in a single weekend, and we spend, Callie and I, entire Saturdays, all of Sunday afternoon, some of you know this well, sort of inside these sports centers. It feels after about 8 hours like you've been at a terribly boring nightclub and you feel a little stunned when you come out. Day after day, weekend after weekend, all this basketball. And I've noticed something that happens at the end of a game or the end of a tournament. If there's one girl who has really exceeded all the others and played at a very high level through the whole game, you will see moms often, 6'2" moms, old athletes moving kind of slowly, walk up to her afterward. It is game recognizing game, right? These queens seeing another young royalty, at least on the basketball court, up and coming, and they want to say hello. And you see it in the boys' games too. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a 13-year-old boy throw down a dunk in a basketball game. It was a miracle, I felt like. And afterward, all these old lions of Chicago basketball walked over to this young man, this boy. Kings recognizing another king. That's what happens. Herod knows that's what happens. That's why these kings are here. There is a threat to his throne, and so he lies to them and he says, tell me where he is, because I want to do the same thing. I want to go to center court. I want to meet this up and comer. I want to pay homage as well to another royal person. But what he really wants to do, and we know this, is he wants to murder this baby in his crib. That's what he wants to do. Because Herod is afraid, and Herod uses violence to rule, and Herod is an absolutely cynical, lying leader. That's who Herod is. When he first became king, he was married to a woman who wasn't Jewish, and in order to increase his favor with his Jewish subjects, he had her arrested along with their son. Both of them were put in jail, and he married a new woman because in his twisted mind he thought, this is really going to get the people to love me. They saw right through it. Didn't work. He was despised by many of his subjects. Herod would do anything to hold on to power. So he tries to fold these 3 kings into his plot, and he probably figured they were men of the world just like he was. Each one of them knew what it took to hold on to a throne. They knew that to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. To rule a nation, you have to kill some people. But these kings have had a vision. They've seen the Prince of Peace. They are no longer loyal to realpolitik. They've knelt before Jesus. They can no longer bend their knee to the logic of brutality or to Herod, who happens to be exercising it at that moment, just as surely as other leaders will exercise it on down the line. These men are now subject to an altogether different sort of king. And so they sidestep Herod and return home by another route, living inside, at this moment, another kingdom. They've placed their faith in forgiveness and in mercy, in weakness, in a God who would rather suffer than kill anyone. They go home by another road, inside of God's kingdom. Their lives have changed because they had a vision. It was no accident that placed Keith in charge of the prayers that morning. I'm sure I would have come up with something to say, but I hadn't had a vision. Keith, though, knew what he was talking about. His life had changed. He became a Christian while he was in prison, serving time for a DUI and vehicular manslaughter. He told me that during that time, no one visited him. He was here at Cook County Jail. Nobody visited him, except for people he didn't know, except for members of the prison ministry from Trinity United Church of Christ. He didn't go to Trinity. He didn't go to any church. But the church came to him, and it changed his life. They brought a vision to him, a vision of the fact that he wasn't unforgivable. The world hadn't given up on him. God still loved him. God's people still loved him. They brought him the gospel, and he read it, and in its pages he saw the newborn Christ, and the vision changed his life. He told me once, I saw myself differently, and my life had to change. That's the test of an encounter with Christ, of a real vision. Did your life change? Do you feel that something must change? Are you on the precipice, on the border of everything being different, of stepping into an altogether different kingdom? How are you different because of your faith? It's a question I ask myself sometimes. What difference does the fact that I have seen Jesus and that I know him, what difference does that make in my life? And if my answer is not much of a difference, well then, I don't believe that I really know him at all. Would everything be the same if you didn't know him? Would your loyalties and your way of living, would they be the same as they are now? Well, then perhaps you don't know him. T.S. Eliot wrote a powerful poem about Epiphany called The Journey of the Magi. And at the end of this poem, he says something quite disturbing, actually. He doesn't say, you see Jesus, you have this vision, you realize your life has to change, and then everything gets better. Instead, he says this, one of the kings reminiscing, all this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again. I would do it again. But set down this. We were led all that way for birth or for death. There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. The kings go home by another route, and they get back, and the people that they rose up out of, the subjects that they rule, the nation that they love, are a foreign people. An old dispensation. They are no longer at home. Their loyalties have died. Even their identity has died, all because Christ was born, and they saw him, and they realized that their lives had to change. And I can't wrap this sermon up neatly. I can't do it. Kelly once said to me, a really good sermon happens when the ending is like the dismount in the Olympics on the high bar, right? You've seen those kids, whoop, whoop, bam, and they stick the ending, and it's perfect. That's a really good sermon, because that's what you'll remember, is the ending. But Epiphany is not a day that provides closure. This day doesn't end with the wise men and their vision of Christ, no more than Christmas ends with you, wise as you are, and your vision of the newborn child of God among us. Your vision of Christ isn't the end. It isn't even the beginning of the end. It's a flash of light. And if you see it, and if you're brave enough to keep your eyes open, that flash brings an awareness. You're inside of a new kingdom now, and your life is going to change. Amen.